Hello there, and welcome to Creatives in Conversation, a podcast series created by myself, visionary artist Roberto. In today's podcast, I'll be speaking with artist and tailor Richard Bliss. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Rob. Nice to see you.
Yeah, very good. Very good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. I think what we'll do for the start of this first Creators in Conversation is start with a confession, which is we have already had a conversation, and I've got to say it was such a good conversation. I was so excited after we had it. I was so excited to get into the editing room and get this thing published. And guess what? Technical difficulties and realizing that actually podcasting isn't as easy as I thought it'd be. So, but now we've double backed up everything. So we're in it, we're here, and we're having this conversation. So, I guess, we can just have a conversation as fluid as normal, but I think what would be good is to start off with a question and then kind of expand from there. So the first question I have written down here is, can you describe for us what it is that you create?
Can I describe I'll go really simple, Rob. And basically I create shirts and I make shirts and I make clothing, but they're neither fashion nor are they wholly artworks. They're ways of capturing and then encouraging conversation. But they're still shirts. Right. And I quite like that. It's like I made a shirt out of paper, and I was in a museum I was doing one of my public makings in the museum, and I was showing the shirt. Anyway, a little boy, and he really was a little boy, I would say he was probably about 7, came running over and he said, "Oh, wow, that's a shirt made of paper." And I said, "Yeah, it is. It's a shirt made of paper. Do you think you could wear it?" And he said, "No, it's made of paper." And I just loved the idea that it was both simultaneously a shirt made of paper, yet it was a shirt made of paper. So it could not be a shirt.
Yes.
It was kind of that's a shirt, but it's not a shirt, it's a shirt. And I just thought that really summed up what I make, really, because it's the only shirt you can literally read stories on, yet it's not a shirt. And that little boy was absolutely right. So that's what I make. I make shirts.
So okay, so you make your own shirts, which is obviously in of itself a craft. It's something that you just don't see we're all aware that shirts are made. We're aware that people make shirts, but it's not necessarily something you see all the time. And
no.
I guess what I really like about what you're doing is you're kind of like revealing this world that obviously is occurring. We all know it occurs, but you're like bringing it out into the open and then using that to start an even deeper conversation.
I make them in public places deliberately so that I can have unexpected conversations. I'm quite happy to make them anywhere that anybody invites me to make them. So I'm not sort of precious about saying, I would never go into a museum or gallery, because I really like being in museums and galleries. But I also like making them in cafes, and I've made them in a market and various other places. And the reason I do it in public is that 2 things are happening, really. One is that I work on a domestic sewing machine, which I describe, I think it's quietly disruptive. That's one of the things that I talk about and I think about, is that I'm being quietly disruptive, because people very rarely see men sewing in public in the kind of Western world that we're in. So for one thing, sewing is seen as either a domestic task, so it's hidden away in the home, and historically, the domestic realm is the feminine realm, the public out realm is the masculine realm. So I'm kind of playing with that idea anyway of masculinity and femininity, and that's a big theme in my work. Or it's hidden away in a factory. And whilst the conditions in clothing factories in this country are mostly good, there have been scandals recently, and it's often the people who are least able to kind of assert their rights in the workplace who are most exploited. Unfortunately, we had a case of that recently in Leicester, where there were found to be people working in that factory where they weren't even earning the minimum wage, and conditions of work that were dreadful. So I'm kind of making the shirts for a whole variety of reasons. The main reason is because I'm interested in exploring the idea of what masculinity is, particularly to try and answer this question for myself, which is that I did this before when we failed to record the interview, but I should describe myself. I'm a 58-year-old cisgender white man with greying hair and greying beard. I'm a gay man, and I'm interested politically in how we disrupt and then destroy patriarchy. But I'm in a relationship with a man, and we're both cisgender men of an age where, and we present as quite traditional looking, older kind of gay couple. So there's quite a strong sense of masculinity in the way that we present ourselves, even though it's not that youthful masculinity. So I'm kind of destroying the thing I love. I'm destroying the thing I love through the work that I make, while simultaneously trying to understand what it's all about. And that was a really quite rambly, long explanation.
I like it. I could keep going with that because you're telling a story, and I think there's a few things that you said there, and I guess I want to perhaps challenge you a little bit on what it is that you're doing with the masculinity thing, because I think that what you could be doing is actually reinventing or reimagining what masculinity is and what that could look like. Just so everybody's clear, in terms of anybody who is listening as opposed to watching this, I would be identified as a white straight male, cisgender, and I understand what that means in terms of how it affords me certain advantages going through life. So I'm very much aware of that, but I'm also aware of how actually we're in a very, very lucky position to be able to step in, as you are, stepping into public spaces and doing things that are, a little bit more, you wouldn't say the word radical, but it is quietly radical because, you present as a certain way and you're doing something that, fits outside the box a little bit, and you kind of get a bit of a free pass by doing that. And I almost think that because you're doing it, you give permission for other people to sort of start that conversation. So, when you get the case of a lot of rowdy guys getting together and one of them starts getting upset about something, it will change the dynamic completely, and people will reveal themselves, and it's very interesting. It's very interesting. But I absolutely love what you're doing in terms of like quietly disrupting. Yeah. I
mean, I think you're absolutely right, Rob, and I think I have to check my privilege alongside that, because I think that being a white middle-aged man does give me a lot of privilege in public space to be bold in a way that other people don't have that opportunity. And I think that people are much less likely to challenge me because society invests in white middle-aged, basically middle-class men a lot of power and privilege, and I think you're absolutely right to remind me and all of us that simply taking up space in the public realm is not an equal process for everybody. but that's partly what I'm trying to explore, really, is how can we use that public space in a way that is more equal, and that we can all feel safe in it and be in it in a way that is that, you know, for some people just going out is a very bold gesture, and just being themselves in the public realm, it can be a very bold thing to do. So thank you for reminding me.
I think what you're doing in terms of like releasing, well, you said you're going out into the public, and what do we all do? So if we're thinking about all of our experiences that are shared, which is, I guess, that we all go out in the public wearing some form of clothing. I mean, you'd be very brave, I guess, to go out in public without any form of clothing, especially in the winter or anything like that. But you're kind of bringing it back down to the grassroots, and what that is what we wear and how we present ourselves, you know, through our appearance, which is something that we can't get away from, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's why I sort of picked on shirts, really. I started off just because I was doing some different work, and I was feeling frustrated that I wasn't making work at the time. And I was chatting with a friend of mine, and she said, you know, well, what do you want to make? Just what do you want to make? In a kind of in a way that often we don't just say to ourselves, well, just get on and make it. We kind of think about it and talk about it instead of doing it. She's an outstandingly good filmmaker. And I said, I've always had this idea that I want to make a really perfect white shirt. And she just said, well, go on then, make it. And of course I was like, oh yeah, I've got to get on and make it now. And I've kind of tinkered around a bit with sewing and done bits and bobs, but it put a bit of a fire under me, and I went off and I actually properly retrained so that I understood how to make clothing. But in the process of doing that, I really started to feel that it was a really rich scene that I'd somehow found, because it's really hard, I think, to get our heads around what masculinity and femininity are. And I think it's often quite hard for us to get around our sense of how we are seen by other people in the world and all of those things. And actually, shirts are, when we start to talk about the clothes that we wear, it begins to open up a whole load of other stories about who we think we are and the experiences that we've had. And I'm interested in masculinity as it manifests itself in people, whatever their biological gender might be. So I know that I also have amongst my friendship group a lot of women who the world would see as quite masculine. But I like having them in my friendship group because I think in general I'm drawn to masculinity. So there's an interesting conversation that can be had there about that presentation of masculinity, that can begin with talking about our clothing. It doesn't begin and end with the shirts. It just begins with the shirts, and then lots and lots of other things follow from it. And yeah, I one of the things that I really struggle with is that I think a lot of the language around masculinity in particular is very negative, and quite rightly so, because masculinity, and particularly the way that some men have chosen to use that masculine power, can be quite negative in society. But there are other aspects of behaviour that we ascribe as being masculine. But when if they appear on the body that is, people have decided is a woman's body, we don't like it. So I'm quite interested in that as well, about how one behaviour, if it's seen in a man, is completely acceptable, but when it's seen in a woman, it's not acceptable. Yet they are, and it's acceptable in a man because it's seen as being a masculine behaviour. And if a woman tries to take on a very masculine behaviour in public, we get a little bit disturbed by that. I think it was really interesting. I know we've had an election since then, but the way that Clinton was talked about in relation to Trump. A lot of the things that were said about Clinton were that she was too masculine, she was too strident, she was too forceful. Yet when you compared those two candidates, all of the behaviours that were seen as being positive in Trump, well, Clinton was using them as well, but she was perhaps using them in a more considered way, yet she was really vilified for it and he was celebrated for it. And I think that's a really stark example of that, particularly when they were placed in public debate, that every time Hillary Clinton became assertive, she would be seen as being far too masculine and aggressive. Yet Trump was very rarely called a bully. Donald Trump was very rarely called a bully.
Yeah.
So, and his bullying behaviour was seen as being, dominant and sure-footed.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how the shirts can often stand in for the language.
I find it interesting that you've kind of been able to pull into, even mainstream politics, because the question that I'd like to ask you is, where did you come from? I know you did you gave me a little hint in our last conversation, but we never really went into that. And I'm really interested in how you've made that journey to where you are now.
Yeah, well, I did my first degree in government and public policy making, which is a politics degree. And I thought that I was really interested in working in public administration in some way and public policy. Although, oddly, I didn't do that in the end, and never really have. I have worked in local government, but not really in policy. But I was always really motivated about making change through the political arena, and I was involved in organised politics for a very long time. I was the first out gay councillor in Newcastle, which I've just made a little film about. So yeah, I was very engaged in local politics. I was very engaged in trade union politics, and I really believed that was where we could make a lot of change. And even when I first started working in the arts, I started working in the arts and arts administration. That was where I wasn't a maker originally. I still carried on being involved in trade union activity and political activity. But subsequently, and I'm still involved, I am to some extent involved in those kind of organised politics, but not nearly as much. And I now feel that I can express myself better through my work than I necessarily can. Express myself, that's the wrong thing. I do express myself through my work, but I'm trying to express my ideas through my work. And I feel that I can both express my ideas, but also engage more people in thinking about what kind of world we want through my work. So yeah, I started in quite a traditional political place, but I would say that I've always and continue to be quite political in the way that I think about my work. I'm very interested in how do we really get things like equal access, and how do we talk about really opening up the kind of cultural institutions so that people feel very welcomed in them.
I can understand. It makes a lot of sense to kind of move from obviously politics into the arts, in a sense, to my mind, thinking about change, because they're both trying to do that, aren't they? They're both trying to do that, but on the levels in which they're doing it are totally different. There was a quote that came to my mind and I can't remember who said it. I know where it's from, but I'm not going to tell anyone where it's from. I'll just leave that one out there. But basically he was saying that politicians use lies to cover things up, whilst artists use lies to tell the truth. So it's a bit different, but it's kind of like in art we can afford to exaggerate, or we can afford to over express something, to highlight things, to make it more communicable, to communicate something a bit stronger. Whilst in politics, you've kind of got this sense of inauthenticity, and you've got this sense of it feels a bit. And I know you said this in our previous conversation about magic and it being, the negative definition of magic, which is something that's underhand. And you can see that in politics, can't you? You can watch it on the screen, and you can watch these politicians speaking, and you can watch them the way they present themselves, and almost every movement they do feels. You could feel to some degree, it depends which politicians you're looking at, but inauthentic. But then you get something like the arts where you're almost encouraged to be as authentic as possible. And you can almost spot a person a mile away when they're not kind of being authentic. So there's something in that, that the power of change and how one is able to do that through these different portals, as it were,
Yeah. No, it's a good way of thinking about it. Definitely.
I've got another question here for you. Just what do you think well, I guess we've already answered that question. I won't ask that question, but is there something like a red thread or a constant that's always fed through your work, and maybe something that you haven't necessarily realized until you've taken a look back?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because you touched on that question before, but I suppose there is a thing about looking back. I don't think I realised quite how much I was trying to make sense of what it means to be a gay man who is kind of. What does it? I think I've always tried to understand that question of how do I sort of negotiate my way through all these relationships with other men, and how that affects the way that I am as a gay man. It's quite a hard thing. It's like
that's something. Yeah, I can imagine. Only imagine how much you could wrestle with that.
Yeah, it's a weird thing when you sort of love and hate masculinity in a kind of, but then, all the men I like and love don't necessarily express their masculinity in traditional ways.
Yeah.
But there's also something really interesting about how being a gay man of a certain age, I think a lot of the men I've known have felt that they have to sort of over-assert their masculinity in some way. So they might feel... I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were talking about how they'd been in the forces. I'm going to be a bit vague because otherwise I'll give away who they are. But they'd been in the forces when they were young, and they were talking about how they took on the most dangerous roles, and they took on the most kind of challenging masculine activities, because if anybody had found out that they were gay, they would have been dishonourably discharged from the services, because when we were younger, you couldn't be out in the services. You weren't allowed to be a lesbian or a gay man in the services. And it made me think that there's kind of an odd shift that's happened around the expression of masculinity, because I think there's been a real shift, particularly by young, queer, non-binary people, about how you can be biologically male but not be a man. And I think that's a really fascinating thing that I've tried to understand in my work and also understand as a person, because I find it really exciting. I love the idea of what does a world look like which is non-binary, and it's different to being transgender. I think that's a completely valid choice that people make. But I suppose for me, I'm quite interested in how I could be non-binary, but I know that I'm not transgender in the way that it's currently constructed.
Yeah, I guess maybe a way of rewording is imagining a world where gender is irrelevant. Which is a huge, we could really go deep into that. I would be really keen for you to kind of describe a project into which you've, shirts has been obviously the focus of the project, but how you've kind of used the sort of specifically on a particular project and these themes that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, we talked last time about the fact that I'd worked around domestic violence and abuse, and I'm still really concerned about the amount of intimate partner violence that there is and how much violence goes on in our homes and in our intimate family relationships. And I think it's not talked about enough. And I spent a long time, but I spent 2 years working on a project called the Selfies Project, which was working with young LGBT people to talk about and think about first relationships, because particularly for young LGBTQI people, there are so few role models and models out there. Most of us are brought up in heterosexual families. Most of us don't have very many opportunities to experience what it might be like to kind of have an intimate knowledge of what a same-gender relationship might look like. So I think when you come out, it's almost like you start your teenage period all over again, because you're having to learn all this stuff. So we did this project where we worked with LGBTQI young people to explore all of that. And we looked at love songs, and we looked at films, and we looked at all sorts of things about how they kind of reinforce a heterosexual model. And then we started to try and make our own work, which expressed something about what we might want to see in a relationship. And that really then began to develop into a much stronger interest about how and why men are so violent, and why we reach for violent behaviour. Not necessarily always physically violent behaviour, but controlling behaviours like, not speaking, or unpredictably exploding with a loud shouting voice, or whatever it might be. And I think I'm still trying to make work that explores that dynamic. Because one of the things, I've done a lot of work with boys, and I find that they really, boys and men have three emotions, and they are fine, which covers everything to do with feeling happy to feeling just kind of content. That there's a huge range of emotions between enormously elated to contentment that are all covered by the word fine. And then the next one is bored. And that is when that covers a whole variety of states that aren't just bored. And then there's angry, and that you can go from one of those states to another quite rapidly, and that often out of boredom comes anger. So, but when I talk to boys about exploring their emotions more deeply, they sometimes reach for anger quite quickly. So, if I've asked boys about, you say you're fine, but what do you mean by fine? Well, I'm just fine. Because what they don't want to do is explore the other emotions that are in there. And I think that's one of the things that contributes enormously to boys in particular, although, of course, girls and women also can use, can be the people who perpetrate intimate partner violence. It is mostly men and boys that do it. I think that what that feeds into is they then are very unable to negotiate the complexities of family life and partner life and all those other things. So they reach for anger really quickly as a way out of a difficult emotional situation. And getting boys and men to talk about that is really difficult, because it means we have to take responsibility for our behaviour. And I hope that somewhere in my work, I somehow create space for men to talk about that, because I think reducing the amount of what we commonly call domestic abuse, but I call intimate and family violence, because I think it's wider than that. If we can reduce that down, I think the impact that it'll have on making a better society is quite quick, but also really important. So that's a long theme that runs through my work, and started with an arts project. And, you know, I went and actually worked in a domestic violence and abuse service, setting up a service for men and boys, but it still continues into my work now.
I find that really interesting how you obviously, you've used the project of making, I'm imagining that it was making a shirt with young boys. And
I've done shirt making, with a group of boys. I've done quite a bit of different textile work with boys. I actually made shirts with a group of men in recovery, and that was a really exciting piece of work that I did, because all those men were there completely voluntarily, and they were some of them. It was one of the only times that I've been in a big group of men where they were really confident and articulate about talking about their emotions. And I think it's because they've had to go through a lot of thinking about themselves to work out why they started to use drugs or alcohol in this case, but also how they wanted their lives to be without drugs and alcohol. And they were incredibly articulate, irrespective of their class background or their how they might describe themselves in terms of their race or any of the other things that are there. They had this common ability to reflect and then act on that reflection.
I think what you were mentioning about how perhaps there is this sort of situation that men get themselves into where they're not able to communicate how they're feeling. I guess I kind of take on the sort of more, maybe less pessimistic view that men aren't necessarily avoiding the conversation, rather that they don't have the words into which to be able to articulate what it is that they're experiencing. So they kind of go to these easy words that seem to be close but not close enough, kind of thing. So it's interesting that you've obviously started with young boys, and you say they've got these, very 5 emotions. Sometimes it could be even less than that, depending on how young the child is. And then as we grow, if we don't develop that vocabulary to be able to articulate these emotions, then we're not able to sort of communicate what it is that we're experiencing and how events do sort of affect us. And I think that kind of possibly relates to how men will gravitate towards violence. The quote by Martin Luther King is, violence is the language of the unheard. And it's like, well, if the individuals haven't got the words into which to be able to communicate, then it starts to make more sense why someone would gravitate towards violence, because when you see violence, then it almost reveals what's going on underneath the surface. There's fear there, or there's anger there, but I'd always argue that underneath anger is fear, and with fear there's anxiety there, and that's what it is. And so I find it really interesting how you then bring men together or boys together to doing something creative, which in of itself you can't. You couldn't go into a gallery and look at a painting and articulate it perfectly, so somebody who hadn't seen it would know exactly what you're talking about. That's exactly the case, isn't it? That's what we're trying to do with emotions. We're trying to articulate it as best you can. But if you haven't developed that skill through reflection or something like that to be able to articulate as closely as possible what it is you're experiencing, then you can see why violence comes up. So I really like this idea that you're using art as a way of trying to develop that conversation.
That was really interesting, that what you said about fear. And I think that I'd never really thought about that, and well, I suppose I have thought about it, but I haven't heard it expressed so well, that behind the anger is fear. Because men very rarely say, I'm frightened. No. It's a really demasculinizing thing, if there's such a word.
Never. You know, and this is actually something, because I'm a social worker during my day, and it was a question that got taught to us, which was whenever I guess it's a quite challenging question to ask, especially if a man is feeling angry or frustrated, to ask them directly in that moment, what is it? What are you afraid of? And it's interesting because I've seen it happen in practice. I've seen other people ask the question, and you can see how people respond. Some people just tell you straight away. Like, it's almost like the question's been direct enough that they can't circumvent it. They have to respond to it. But obviously, art doesn't have to be like that. You know, when you're making a shirt, it can be, you know, you could be finding lots of different avenues to the same thing, you know. I really like, for some reason, whilst you were talking, I really like this idea of like, perhaps if I'm going to like imagine a hypothetical of a really traditional masculine man coming in and making a shirt with yourself, because, you know, maybe it's one of his friends that encouraged him, you know, just take the piss, do this, and to sit there and maybe just do a slight adjustment to the collar and then put on this shirt and almost take the mick out of themselves, and then when they go home they go, I really like this shirt actually, you know, and but it's that subtlety where things change a little bit and they experience something different, you know, something different, a new way of, you know, expressing their identity, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think men who are least frightened of their masculinity being undermined, sometimes in the world they look quite sort of hyper masculine. So they might be, you know, they might well sort of fulfill all the ideals of what a man ought to be, and because of that, they're less concerned about how other men might see them, because in their daily lives, they're constantly reassured that they're at the top of the masculinity tree, if you like. Mm-hmm. And I think for some men who feel that perhaps they're not expressing their masculinity, it's something I talked to another friend of mine, a fantastic drama worker and former actor, but now does drama work, called Tom Roy. And he and I have had lots of conversations about being sissies and what does that mean. And that, you know, he was a sissy at school and he still presents as being a bit of a sissy. And we were kind of going, oh, there's something really empowering about reclaiming that kind of sissiness as men who are in their late 50s now. I mean, I have to say he talked about that for some time, but he's very he's really interesting in talking about how when he sees that, particularly in boys who don't necessarily identify as LGBTQ or I, or they're boys who don't have any LGBTQ or I allies or confidants around them, that what he notices is how frightened those boys are of doing non-masculine activities. So even doing drama, which they would see as play, they're very reluctant to do it because they're so concerned that their masculinity is going to be undermined by doing something that they think is sissy or girl. I mean, we deliberately don't say girly because we don't want to get into that kind of gendered stuff, but cis is quite a useful word because it's such a negative word and we know what it means. Whereas boys who might be fulfilling more of a kind of masculine ideal, so they might be boys in a school setting that are good at sport, or, you know, they're heterosexual and they're popular, they're much more likely to feel okay about picking up a piece of sewing and having a go at it because they've got all of this very strong masculinity to lean on. So I think it is kind of interesting about who amongst our boys is prepared to have a go at things. And I think a lot of it comes from social confidence.
Yeah.
So if boys are made to feel very confident and happy about themselves, even if they don't conform to a masculine stereotype, they'll be quite bold in the world.
Yeah. So when you did your workshops with the young boys, where did you do it? Where did you gather these young boys into a space? Was it in a school or was it in that?
Yeah, well, I've worked in schools, I've worked in community settings, I've worked in art centres that are kind of attached to schools. Okay. So I've worked with boys in lots of settings.
Yeah. I find that really interesting because I guess whilst you were talking in there about a young boy's experience being in school, and in particular, thinking about school and then thinking about prison next to each other, and if you sort of see these two institutions, the academic school, we've got like a clustering of people together, haven't we? You've got it in the prison, you've got it in the schools, and it almost creates these archetypes of people, these stereotypes of people, which is boys would be safer to. I'm just sort of saying as the experience that I've experienced, as well as what I've seen, is that boys will feel more comfortable to gravitate towards what seems to be gaining some trend or some traction, which is the ultimate, masculine stereotype within school. And then you've got the same in prisons as well. So it's like when your only options are in school, which is conform or be outcasted, which is a lot of young boys' experiences, which is if they don't conform, then they're outcasted, and then that has huge damaging effect on itself. But when you're doing something outside of that school setting, they're almost like a little bit more. I'm imagining they're a little bit more confident going into a space like that because the groups are smaller. There's less of a hierarchical thing going on. There's less posturing between boys. All the boys are coming in, all doing something that they know is not necessarily going to be accepted within school or something like that. So it's almost like you open a little portal in their own mind, a little space in their own mind to actually say, being a boy, being a man could look different. There's another version of it, and then that could just infinitely, go in another direction, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting when I work in different settings, when I work in with what I would say opted in boys, so boys that have chosen to do something like school activities, or they've chosen to come to something that's being laid on, they're completely willing, and there's very little of that sort of jockeying, if you like. They kind of are much more up for getting on with it. And quite often, they're arty boys, they're boys that are interested in arts and drama. So they're lifting themselves out from being a particular kind of boy anyway into a different place, I guess. The less opted in boys, I find it fascinating how much the adults that are policing them have invested in keeping them in certain ways. So when those boys, I'm very confident that I'm not going to lose control in a kind of classroom setting. I'm too old, I'm too long in the tooth, I'm too experienced to kind of be frightened by a group of teenagers in a classroom. Yeah. But what I do find is that teachers are incredibly quick to step in with boys who I think are being quite unproblematic. So they kind of have an expectation that they're going to do something all the time, and their mechanisms for control are extremely punitive. Yeah. So there's a lot of sanction and removal, which are all of which to me plays in, and girls are much less sanctioned and removed, and I don't think that works for anybody. But I find it fascinating how, if I ask for comment, how much some teachers feel they need to control the way that commentary is given back to me. So, there'll be a lot of, why have you said that? And, you need to sit down, you need to behave, and I'm kind of like, no, I'll get the 10 minutes of madness, and they'll all do that for 10 minutes. But I'm really interested in not stopping those boys, but asking those boys why they're behaving that way. So why are you here? What do you want to be here? What are you going to do if you leave? Where are you going to go? Trying to get a sort of atmosphere where I'm trying to get to that question that you said before, what are you frightened of? So I'm trying to get to that point of saying to them, why are you showing off? What is it that you're so frightened that we're really going to see? And then getting them to put that into a piece of work in some way, whether that's a little piece of writing or a drawing or some kind of expression. And then I get them to do incredibly brave things. So one of the things I always say to the teachers, particularly if they're teachers that I haven't particularly got a rapport with at the beginning of a session, I'll say, okay, everybody, I want you to do X. And it might be, I just want everybody to do some free drawing about, make some shapes on the page. I just want everybody to make some shapes on the page. And everybody in the room will be doing it except for the teacher. And I'll say to the teacher, oh, are you not joining in? And of course, that immediately puts them in the place of the children of going, oh, you're asking me to do something that's really quite frightening because I'm not familiar with it, but you expect all these children to do it. And teenagers are the least well prepared for doing things that are unfamiliar to them. And then within that, teenage boys are the very worst at taking risks, which is why they jump off buildings and all that sort of stuff. And teachers find that really unsettling. But of course, good teachers are very relaxed and they will be doing it anyway because they want to join in. But then asking people to share their work. Oh, let's everybody look at what we've done.
That's the thing, isn't it?
It's horrifying.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Like, I really commend teachers for the jobs that they do. I think they do an extremely hard job. I know I did a bit of teaching assistant work just, for a space of a few months, and it is really challenging. I could see how it's really challenging and how that could shape, a person who goes in with a certain idea of what teaching looks like and come out, a very, very different situation. But yeah, definitely to make something and then just flippantly say, now show everybody in the class, because it's almost like, you've literally put your heart and soul into something potentially. Some people, even when somebody just makes a mark on a piece of paper, it might be a scribble, as soon as you ask them to show something, it exposes them in a certain way. And it's like, when the teacher will just say, oh, just show everybody in the class. If that isn't received with, laughter, then you might be lucky, but I wouldn't want to risk, even myself now, going into my 30s now, of like showing just one of my pictures to a class of teenagers. That's going to be the most brutal thing ever. And kids know this as well.
The thing when I draw is that I'm rubbish at drawing. So I'm always, if we are doing something in group work where we're possibly going to need to share or we're going to do things together, I will always share mine first, because it will be... It won't be what they're expecting. I think very few artists are actually able to kind of create amazing drawings just off the top of their head. And actually is that particularly useful when we're working with young people anyway, because that'll intimidate them. So I kind of do that thing of, but I agree with you, teachers mostly are fantastic, and most of the teachers I meet are brilliant, but I do get a bit worried about kind of fixed expectations, particularly of badly behaved. What does that mean? I've got past I do a lot of going, are these opted in now? Because I'm a bit past the age where I want to just work with the most hard to reach young people. Or I want to work with children that really badly behave. No, I want to work with all those. If I'm working with boys, I want to work with all those boys who want to get an A in their art GCSE or an A in their art A level. They're the ones that I really want to work with because they're lovely. I'm now like, oh, let's let somebody else work with the really difficult boys that really misbehaving, because I'm quite old and tired now.
It's a different role, isn't it? Like you've especially for art teachers as well, because they're already like trying to teach something which for some students they'll never open their eyes to it at all, and you've got to manage those kids which don't want to be there. They've got no option but to be there, and then you've obviously got the other kids who are really passionate, and you can feel that you could nurture something in them. You could see that you could really boost their creativity or boost their inspiration, and just giving them even just the smallest of techniques. But yeah, for art teachers to have to really deal with those two sides, which is without neglecting one, because there's two jobs there, really, isn't there?
Absolutely, they are completely different jobs, with a completely different set of outcomes to them. The ones that want to kind of work in the art world are after something very different to what art might be able to help for children and young people who are not interested in the art world, but we're all interested in expressing ourselves. So they're very different things.
It's different ways of trying to reach the same goal, isn't it? I have this question here, which we've got about 5 minutes, so I'm wondering whether you could actually expand upon this, and however far it goes, it'll go. If you could change just one thing about the world, what would it be?
I would end patriarchy.
Wow.
It's not possible to explain how I would do that in 5 minutes.
Right, okay.
It's one step at a time.
Okay.
And I think I would start with,
well, rather than, you don't have to try and figure out the system now. I think
that is a relief.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, what would that world look like?
Oh, it would be lovely. It would be full of unicorns with lovely long manes. And, in all seriousness, I think there are some really simple things. So I think if we end patriarchy, we've ended so many other things as well, which begin with very important stuff around poverty and access to resources. And I think that those fundamentals we could put right quite quickly. There's a fantastic advert running for WaterAid at the moment, which reminds us that we get very excited about finding water on Mars. And I do understand why that is exciting, but we have to place that in the context of the fact that 1 in 10 people across the world don't have access to clean water. And there is a very strong part of me that thinks, yes, it is important for us to have a sense of exploration and a sense of change, but I'm very much in the camp of let's use our ingenuity and our desire for exploration to give everybody clean water. And then when we've achieved that, let's start looking for water on Mars. And that doesn't mean that I understand the complexities that go on between those two things, but in a very simple sense, I think if we can put right some of the things that are on our doorsteps, and then we start to think about some of the things that we can put right in the wider world, which are things like access to clean water, well, then we can start talking about the environment, and we can start talking about a whole number of things. But if we focus on patriarchy, and we do the things in our everyday lives that make men and women more equal, then that we take a sort of leap towards all those other things quite quickly.
Wow, that was, What? So, Richard, where can people find you?
It would be lovely if anybody's interested. They can go to richardbliss.co.uk. To keep it simple, it's richardbliss, all as one word, .co.uk. And I have a website that I sometimes remember to update.
Lovely. I'm hoping everybody's going to flock over there and just see obviously what you're about, because it is exciting when you can actually dive into somebody's portfolio and see that there's something coming through here and there's something underneath. And I think you gave us a hint there of what it is that is driving your work. So thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me to do this, Rob. And I hope lots of other people come on and talk to you, because it's a brilliant thing to have started. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Means the world. Thank you very much for being the first guest twice. Thank you. Thank you.